Lord, we ask you to guide our conversation today. Be with us as we reflect on the unique and precious light of children. Fill us with childlike curiosity and wonder, but with the clarity, wisdom, and maturity of adults. Increase in us our energy to nurture the spiritual formation of children with the playfulness, care, and reverence it deserves. Fill us now with a renewed call to protect and safeguard the innocence and vulnerability of the children in our communities. Creator God, we trust you and we ask you to lead us, and most importantly, let the children come to you and know you from generation to generation. Amen. I am really encouraged. I'm really encouraged that so many of us are here, and your willingness to participate in the morning that's dedicated to the kids is a really hopeful sign. So I'm filled with hope, and I love this quote that I'm going to read to you from Nelson Mandela. There can be no keener revelation of a society's soul than the way in which it treats its children. And I'm going to read it again, but swap out the word for society, church to society, okay? There can be no keener revelation of a church's soul than the way in which it treats its children. I think that we should all take great solace in the fact that we as the church are doing this work, that we're intentionally honoring the treatment of children. Thanks for making this happen with me. This morning, we're presenting from a variety of perspectives, topics, and approaches. Some of you may be really familiar with many of them, and some of you may not, may be hearing about them for the first time. But I invite you, wherever you are in your ministry, to wipe the slate clean, if you will. To consume these presentations as though you were actually new to ministry. And let's release any preconceived notions that we have about what children's ministry is or was, and let's imagine together a whole new approach. Although we may be talking about children's church in a traditional way, I'm asking you to see this for the first time with fresh eyes. So let's take a breath together and really just release the pain that we may have experienced, the pain of failure. Many of us have looked out into children's church. Nobody's in the pews, nobody's in the chairs. Let's release that pain of the failure, the pain, the disappointment of those empty chairs, and embrace instead the potential that we have here of this blank slate. Let's embrace this open landscape of possibility that is before us. And as we look forward now, this new approach may not be called Sunday school. In fact, it may not even happen on a Sunday. It may take the form of workshops or after school programs or picnics or park play, art classes. You're getting the gist of it. But we're moving into a whole new time. One that maybe one day we might actually be able to call post-pandemic. But during this period of pandemic, we know that part of the void the children have felt this void quite a lot in terms of the way the church has been showing up for them. So it's crucial now for us to look forward with hope, something that we all, I think, can agree that has been in short supply these past 19 months, but one thing that the children can model for us and that we desperately need in the church is the hope, the energy, the vitality, and the joy of children. So as we're about to launch in, I want you to go easy on yourselves. Don't get overwhelmed. We're going to present lots of different ideas. Not every idea is for every person. We're probably going to make mistakes along the way. We will omit things, but let's just be gentle with ourselves and with each other and with our ministry. And as we journey this morning, I want you to wonder and consider where your gifts are and where your call is in your respective communities. A few words on safety and safeguarding before we begin. It's no secret that the church has a long and complicated history of abuse with regards to children. Parents, we know, are seeking spiritual nurture, spiritual formation for kids, but for their children, but they're maybe not turning to the church because of this history. So we need to be mindful of that as we embark on children's ministry. There's so much work to do in terms of trust building and being intentional about the safety and the safeguarding of children. And when you think about safety, I don't mean just the physical safety, but I'm talking about safety and harm from the perspective of spiritual safety, emotional, psychological, and physical. So I would like to provide a resource. It'll be here in the chat for you to think about. I've been in consultation with an organization called Plan to Protect, and they offer certifications and trainings on safety and policy in particular for children, for the vulnerable population, for this vulnerable population. So I would recommend a really thorough examine of safety and harm before you begin any children's ministry. The topic is vast and complex, and we're not going to tackle it all in one morning. We're gonna do our very best, but really our hope today is to inspire you to try something. So hopefully we'll have a little fun while we're at it this morning. Hopefully we'll learn something, and without further ado, let's let the wondering begin. So I will be inviting speakers under different categories. Our first category is creativity, community, and connection. Each speaker has 9 minutes. I'm going to be ruthless about these 9 minutes, and I'll give you a 1 minute warning prior to your, basically I'll be like unmuting something like, you've got 1 minute left, speaker. So I'm not trying to be rude. I just want to respect our deadline. So I will invite the first speaker, Section 1, Sheilagh McGlynn, to talk about a view from the National Church. You can find her bio in the chat. Thank you, Sheilagh. Let's do it.
Great. Thank you, Leanne. And thank you, everybody, for being here. I am going to share my screen. Let's see. It's the moment of truth. There it is. I work in the General Synod offices. Can everybody see my screen? Yes? Everybody, okay, I've got a thumbs up from Leanne. Okay, start. Play. There we go. I work in the General Synod offices in Toronto. I support youth leaders mostly, but I'm going to speak from the perspective of young people today, because I think a lot of people doing children's ministry sometimes bleed into the youth ministry area. Sometimes people doing youth ministry bleed into the children's ministry. And so I see that as a very thin veil between the two. This opening slide, I will admit that in the last 18 months, more of my work looks like that top left bubble of the Zoom screen and the people I work with, but I wanted to give a little bit of like, I work with volunteers from across the country. I work with staff people from across the country, and I get to support them in the work that they do with young people. I will admit that the support in the last 18 months has been on the heavier side. It's been like, things are hard, things are tough. And I guess I want to just acknowledge that the first thing I want to acknowledge today is that there's a level of anxiety in the world right now. And young people are feeling it, leaders are feeling it, church leaders are feeling it, everybody's feeling it. And in my other hat, I also work as a psychotherapist. And so I'm not new to the issue of anxiety. That's something I experience a lot in my work from other people. But what I'm experiencing now from the youth leaders that I'm talking to is off the charts. And the young people that we're working with, off the charts. So I just want to acknowledge that that's something that's out there. And I have I like to approach this from maybe a little bit of a fun, there's the map of Canada. If you didn't know, that's our Anglican dioceses across the country that I work with. Back to anxiety. I don't know if you know the Awkward Yeti, but if you don't know the Awkward Yeti, follow them because they have a fun way of looking at hard topics. So they have characters, parts of the body. So this is a conversation between heart and brain. And heart and brain are two of the main characters in the Awkward Yeti. And the heart says, hey, brain, what you braining about? And the brain says, I'm thinking about the future. And then the heart says, wow, the future hasn't even happened yet. And the brain says, I'm thinking of every possible outcome of every possible decision. And then the heart says, well, that sounds like a lot of work. Wouldn't it be easier to like wait for the actual future to get here so we know what it is? And then the brain says, let me think about that for a while. I think that anxiety is like something that we're trying to lean into, something that we don't know about. And heart has a good point. What's the point? We can't change the future. It's going to happen. But the brain is on overload right now. And in the pandemic, people are constantly, I don't struggle with anxiety personally, but I had anxiety about the future in this last 18 months. So that's something where we're all coming from, just acknowledging that. I also want to acknowledge that the feelings that leaders are having right now, if you're having feelings of like frustration and, oh my God, this is so hard, I'm being stretched in different ways that I've never been able to do this before, I want you to know that you are not alone. This is a really important thing, that if you feel like, oh my God, I can't do this, make sure that you have some sort of support, some sort of, like, if you, I don't know, maybe you have a parish that has a great committee, lean on that committee. Maybe you don't have a committee. Maybe there's another leader, a church over that you can talk to. Maybe it's Leanne, reaching out to Leanne or your own diocesan support. To in those moments where you feel like, I can't do this anymore, reach out. That's a really important thing right now. And I've done it myself. I've done it for other people. If you don't have anybody, you can reach out to me. I'll put my email in the chat later. So you aren't alone. Everybody's doing this and we're all struggling. I also want to say, one of the things that this is not a pandemic learning for me. I've known this all along, but people who work with young people are the most creative people I know. They are the ones who are willing to think outside the box. They have a vision for something and they're not afraid to do it. And so you are one of those people. And I thank you for that, because our church needs you. It needs you to push those boundaries. I cannot tell you how many people came to me for Zoom help when the pandemic started, because I was already using Zoom to do my work. And I was like, how does it work? How does it work? Luckily, we were doing this before we needed it. And I think that the church needs the vision and creativity of you all to keep pushing those boundaries wider and wider and wider, to accept more and more people. Like we mentioned at the beginning, like, this is often the ministry that gets underfunded or underlooked at, but we need to keep doing that. And I will acknowledge that the creativity comes at a cost. So I'm going to talk a little bit about that later. It's hard to be the creative person all the time, but I know you have it in you and I know you're doing it. And I thank you for that. One pandemic learning I had, so I hosted a training for youth leaders in the spring of last year, where I was hearing youth leaders were like, okay, I don't know what else to do. Like I've tried to do everything. We're doing things on Zoom. I just need more information. And so I contacted an organization called Adventure Works. They work outside of the Hamilton area. And they led an online training for us to work online with young people. And the one piece that they said that I thought, yes, is connection before content. Lots of youth leaders are talking about, like, how do I do confirmation classes in the middle of a pandemic and nobody wants to be on Zoom? And what I heard from that training was, don't worry about the confirmation classes, just connect with your people. If you don't connect with your people, then the confirmation class is just going to lie flat. The irony is, when the connection happens, when you have those little chats at the beginning, or you drop off a care package on their doorstep or whatever, they're going to start to be like, oh, there's something here. And that's when, maybe you can have a class about a conversation about some sort of scripture or something like that. Can happen later, but connection is where we're at. That's community, that's church. So connection before content. The last piece that I'm going to talk about, and this comes from that concept that it's hard to be creative. And why is my screen not advancing? There we go. Self-care. I feel like this is my soapbox these days. Take care of yourself. You need to take care of yourself so that you can do this work. And I'm not talking about, well, maybe I'm talking about book yourself a massage or a day off, or whatever that is. Whatever self-care looks like for you is great. But I'm also talking about spiritual self-care. So we've probably heard the phrase, faith is not taught, it's caught, right? Like we can't teach faith. It's just something of who we are. So we need to be strong in our faith as leaders to be able to be present and grounded and nurturing in the environment that we work in. So I would challenge, yep, thank you. I've got my timer going too, so I've seen that. I'm going to challenge you as I close off is what is something that you've read or watched or listened to that has inspired you this week? What has filled your soul? What are the things that you can do for you so that your cup can be spiritually full? And so I'm going to leave you with that as something that I see people being depleted across the country when I talk with them, and that's something we need to build up in ourselves. And I talk about that in myself too, that I have to work on that too. So thank you all for listening. My thing says 8 minutes and 37 seconds. 8 minutes and 37 seconds. Thank you so much. And I will be putting something in the chat of inspiration that I didn't have time to share. And it's a secret link. It's not public yet. That comes from our Canadian Lutheran Anglican Youth Gathering this summer of Sarah Bessey speaking about the road to Emmaus. So I'm going to put that in the chat. Hopefully you can be inspired. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Sheilagh. I would like to welcome a couple people that just popped in. We will be muted, but there will be a chance for you to ask questions at the end. Also, questions for Sheilagh. If you have any, please take notes and make sure to speak with Sheilagh at the end if you have any questions. Thank you so much for that, Sheilagh. That was an excellent way to kick us off. The part one is creativity, community, and connection. And I will now invite the Reverend Grace Burson to share on the topic of telling the story, and keep your eye on the chat to read Grace's bio.
Good morning. I begin with a disclaimer, which is that basically everything I'm going to say in this presentation has been said already and better by my mother, Gretchen Wolfe Pritchard, at whose knee I learned most of what I know about children's ministry. But I have also been doing ministry on these principles for, God, close to 20 years now. So let me tell you a story. In the beginning, God made the world. It was very beautiful. God made people to live in the world and love it and care for it. And God chose one family to be God's chosen people. God called Abraham's name, Abraham, Abraham. And Abraham said, "Here I am." Abraham was the father of Isaac, and Isaac was the father of Jacob and Esau, and Jacob was the father of Joseph, who went down into Egypt and saved the people from famine. But many years passed, and there was a new ruler in Egypt who made the people into slaves. They cried out to God in their slavery, and God heard them. And God appeared to Moses on the holy mountain and called, "Moses, Moses." And Moses said, "Here I am." And God said to Moses, "You will be the one to lead my people out of slavery." So Moses led the people across the Red Sea, and the waters were divided before them, and they crossed over on dry ground. In the desert, God appeared to them on the mountain and gave them the law. God said, "I am the Lord your God. You shall have no other gods before me. Do not lie, cheat, kill, or steal. Live with fairness and truth." And the people took the tablets of the law and put them in a golden box, the Ark of the Covenant. After 40 years in the wilderness, God led the people across the River Jordan into the Promised Land, a land flowing with milk and honey, where they had everything they needed. And the people rejoiced and settled in the land and built the holy city, Jerusalem, with a palace for the king and a temple, the house of the Lord, where they kept the Ark of the Covenant in the inner room, the Holy of Holies. And the priests went in to make offerings to God and to ask God's blessing on the life of the people. But as the years went by and the people lived in the land, they grew lazy and careless. They lied and cheated and stole from each other and fought and hurt and killed each other and trampled the poor and spoiled the earth and worshiped strange and ugly gods. Time and again, God fought for the people against the enemies who attacked the city, but at last God allowed them to be defeated. The enemies besieged the city and the people starved and died in the streets. And finally, the city fell, the temple was burned to the ground, and the people were taken away into exile. Beside the waters of Babylon, they cried to God, "How can we sing the Lord's song in a strange land? Our city is fallen, our ark of the law is gone. How can we still be God's people?" But God listened to them and sent prophets who promised them hope and a return to their own land. And God did bring them back with joy, and they rebuilt the walls of Jerusalem, and they rebuilt the temple. And once again, they promised to be God's people, and God promised to be their God. And the people were not always faithful, but they waited and hoped for God to do a new thing. And in time, God did do a new thing. God chose a young woman, Mary, to be the mother of God's own son. His name was Jesus, and he was born to poor parents and grew up in the town of Nazareth. He left home and was baptized by the prophet John in the River Jordan. Filled with God's Spirit, Jesus taught the people and healed them and fed them and welcomed children and raised the dead. He told stories of how God's kingdom was like the smallest of seeds that would grow into a great plant. And the people listened to him gladly, and they said, "This is good news. Now we don't have to be afraid and we don't have to fight. There is enough and more than enough." But the leaders of the people were afraid that Jesus would take away their power, and they put him to death by hanging him on a cross, and they buried him in a tomb. But after 3 days, he rose again. For 40 days, he was with his friends, and then he went away from them to be with God, to be everywhere at once, like God. He sent God's Spirit to live in their hearts, to fill them with God's power and love, and to tell the good news to all people everywhere. And so we have the church. The church is for everyone, young and old, rich and poor, all ages and shapes and genders. We come into the church by being baptized, and we promise to be God's people, and God promises to be our God. God feeds us with the bread and wine, Jesus's body and blood, enough and more than enough. Each of us has a different story and a different life, but all of us one day will die. But that's not the end of the story. Jesus promised to come again to make a new heaven and a new earth, the new Jerusalem coming down from God, the holy city whose gates are always open, with the tree of life in her midst and the river of God of life flowing through her streets. There will be no more hunger or fear, no more lying or cheating or stealing or fighting or hurting or hating, no more death. God will lead his people to fountains of living water and wipe away every tear from their eyes. I just told you the entire biblical story in approximately 5 minutes. And yes, I left out a lot, but I also included some essential pieces like the fall of Jerusalem and the exile to Babylon that often get left out of the way we tell our faith stories to children. The way we tell this story to kids is often random at best. We give them bits and pieces with no indication of how they fit together, and often presented as though the important part is the moral lesson that can be abstracted from them. But the Bible, although it contains many and varied narratives and many parts that aren't narrative at all, nevertheless is one story. And like all good stories, it begins with once upon a time and it ends with happily ever after. Telling this story as a story, which may have many parts, but which also has an overall arc that makes sense, should be the most basic fundamental element of everything we do in Christian formation and community. And for kids, there's a second piece, providing images, simple, replicable images to go with the story. You'll have noticed in the pictures of the Beulah felt board that accompanied my storytelling, the way that some very simple shapes were combined and recombined, not only to show what was happening, but to make connections between the various episodes. And when you have more than 4.5 minutes at your disposal, the repeated images and the phrases that go with them are even more noticeable. These pieces are deliberately designed to be simple enough that kids as young as 4 can draw them recognizably, and thus they can become a visual vocabulary of faith for kids whose emotional and spiritual processing happens largely through drawing. You probably had a spark of recognition when you saw the nativity scene partway through the story. The manger scene with Mary and Joseph, the baby, animals, and the star is one of the few religious images widespread enough that most kids can draw it. But there's absolutely no reason that we can't make many other similar scenes and images as available so that they can draw on stock portrayals of trees, mountains, stars, deserts, altars, temples, prophets, doves, bread, wine, robes, crowns, lambs, and angels, just for a start, as they cultivate their spiritual imaginations and process their own experiences through the lens of faith. I've run out of time to put additional resources here. I'll put them in the chat, but I just wanted to close by saying that this provides a faith that can grow with children, because one of our major challenges is that kids see Sunday school and church as something to outgrow. And so this is a way to give them developmentally appropriate images and stories that also are not something that they then feel is childish and has to be left behind. So thank you very much. And I look forward to answering your questions later on.
Thank you so much, Grace. That was visually stunning. Yes, again, keeping in mind that you'll have a chance to speak with Grace more at the end. I will now invite Valerie Taylor to speak on the topic of a new resource that she has created, and I'll let her say what that is, but I'm very excited. So let's welcome Valerie.
Hi, I'm the director of day camps at Crosstop Ministries, as you'll see in my bio. And every summer, I'm super busy with about 30 day camps happening across Canada. The last 2 summers have been really hard. It's been really quiet around here. And despite the fact that our committee worked hard to figure out some virtual experiences and other resources for children's ministry in the summer, unfortunately, no communities hosted a day camp of any sort. So this past summer, I decided I would do something about that and spend my time doing something creative that could perhaps be helpful to communities as we move out of pandemic and even now as we're still stuck in it. I've had the privilege of being a children's ministry coordinator in 3 different parishes over my life, and they were all really different. I started out in a very traditional congregation. Then I went to St. Stephen's House, which met in former rectory and had a drum kit in the corner, and we sat in the living room on chairs. And most recently, after St. Stephen's closed, I formed a small house church with some like-minded people that meets in my living room. So all those things came together in my mind, along with a really important component of our day camp program, which is called the Creative Connection. In that part of the program, the campers spend time every day planning a closing worship gathering, which is for the whole community at the end of the day camp week. The campers experience things like liturgical dance. They learn about writing the prayers of the people. They bake Eucharistic bread. They make vestments for the clergy. And they just get to experience how it is to pull together a time of really important worship for the whole church community. So I put all those things together in something called Come Together, which is a resource book of all ages gatherings for the whole church community. I hope you can see this large enough. Is that a good size? Hope so. Come Together focuses on the feasts and festivals of the church's year. I think it's really important when you're doing out-of-the-box worship to focus on something that can ground us. And we're really blessed in our tradition to have the church year and the seasons of the liturgical year. So this bunch of resources is about all age gatherings for the whole community that can happen throughout the year. In my introduction in the book, I talk about building a really strong team who can work on pulling together these gatherings. It shouldn't fall exclusively to the person who is the children's ministry coordinator, although no doubt that person will be involved. But the clergy, musical people, technical people should all be part of a planning team for these gatherings. I think that if a community is not keen on doing worship outside the box, then it's really important, of course, that the clergy are on board, but it's also important that those who are planning all age gatherings really take the time to craft them in such a way that is honoring to God and also will draw in the people who are less convinced that perhaps making chai tea mix on a Sunday morning isn't exactly your usual worship experience. So I'm going to just show you, the cover of the book shows the liturgical calendar, and in the book there are descriptions of how to make a similar calendar. You could make a large one for your whole community, or you could show people how to make small ones that they could take home and have in their own homes, so that children and adults will recognize the different seasons of the church year, which are just such a wonderful grounding to who we are. I'm going to focus on the harvest gathering as an example, because we're in the season of ordinary time or Pentecost right now, and we've just celebrated Harvest Thanksgiving. Each of the gatherings has an introduction, which sort of just describes how it came together and what that season is about, or what that particular gathering is about. And then after that, there's a running order, which is a resource that I expect people would want to print out for members of their planning team, and in which they can put their own notes and the names of people who are leading different components of the gathering. It's, as I said, it's really important that everyone knows their different jobs so that things can run as smoothly as possible. There's going to be glitches and there's going to be mess, but I think it's really important if you can focus on the different elements. And each community can adapt these types of gatherings to their own differences in liturgy or traditions, although the concept is to start looking at worship outside the box. Finally, each of the gatherings has a resources section, which includes all sorts of instructions for games and quizzes and art projects and even recipes, because some of the gatherings have a suggestion for lunch after church in the community. All of them also have suggestions for online worship or a hybrid style of worship if your community is still worshiping that way. I just want to share some other hopes and thoughts I have for the book. Let me get this back to another page. I think being grounded in the liturgical seasons while exploring new models together is a really important concept. And I think that also it's really neat to think of how Jesus taught in places outside conventional worship spaces. He taught outdoors, and many of the gatherings are suggested as outdoor worship experiences. He also taught in people's homes, and all of the gatherings that are included have been actually tested in one of those kind of spaces, either in a church community, in a conventional church space, or in someone's home. So they're not just like randomly suggested and they're not going to work. One hopes that they would actually work. And I know that a lot of places would not feel that they could manage to have this sort of a gathering once a month, but initially you might consider having them just on a more frequent basis. I've also had the opportunity, someone has volunteered to do a French translation of this resource, and I hope that will be available soon as well. I think moving forward, we need to set aside some of the old models of Sunday school. Sunday school is actually only a product of the Industrial Revolution, and prior to that, church communities did meet together with everybody together. And I do understand that children need to learn at their own level on a regular basis, but there are many adults who can learn in other ways than just sitting in a conventional worship gathering. That some adults respond better to art or to poetry, and so that these gatherings are not just for children or just for adults, they're for a strong church family. And I think working together like that can just be an amazing experience where older people can help a younger person working on something, and a child can offer prayers in a way that will touch the adults of the congregation. So we're hoping to launch the ebook in November through our website. And if you have other questions about it, you can contact me at the Crosstop Ministries office as well. Thank you for giving me this opportunity to talk about all age gatherings and coming together.
No, it is me who thanks you, Valerie, because that was beautiful. And hi, Thomason. Thanks so much for that. I would love to be able to, hopefully Valerie and I will be in close contact so that I can also help to disseminate the information around that resource. I think it's a beautiful and important resource. So I'll be in touch with you about that too. I would now like to invite, still we are in part 1, creativity, community, and connection. We're going to switch gears a little bit and talk about music ministry with my friend, Dr. Jonathan White.
Morning, everyone. I'm going to be talking to you this morning about music ministry. I should qualify that it's coming from a very specific point of view, from a more, I guess, traditional music program idea. That's not to say that there aren't other types of music programs that children can successfully do and enjoy, but this is the experience that I come from. The photograph that you can see at the moment is taken from a Royal School of Church Music choristers course that I used to run here in Oxford. It had, prior to COVID, been running for about 30 or 40 years, and I'm going to use it as a bit of a case study for this morning, but there'll be a few other bits and pieces that I'll throw in as well. Interviewing a 12-year-old chorister, Ben Liberatore reports that the child involved said, "We're like child paramedics." Benjamin is doing a PhD at the moment in anthropology at Columbia University, looking at children in choirs and how their experience has shaped them emotionally, spiritually, and the perspectives that they have on the world. You might have seen a few headlines actually recently about music, if you read certain publications at least, looking at how music heals, how it teaches spirituality, and how children react to it. And there's a lot of interest in more traditional music, I think, amongst children, as I'll be showing you from the course that I used to run. I've got a few musical excerpts to show you as well. The first one coming up, this is from our 2018 course, which had about 7 to 8 choruses, I think. The course that has been running in Oxford was originally a diocesan-wide course for children in church choirs. We're quite lucky here that we do still have a number of churches that have active music programs for children. But in more recent years, we've been drawing increasingly from wider and wider, and now children come from as far as Edinburgh and other far-flung corners of the UK. Many of them do sing in active church choirs, but others come from a church choir where they're the only child who might only sing once a month. The course was structured around 3 days, even song every day. And just to give you an indication, that's the sort of quality of music making that they can manage just after 3 days of singing together, when most of them have never met each other before. Children do learn very quickly. They respond very well to this style of music, and also the structure and framework of an even song service appeals to them a lot. It gives them a snapshot of the church and how it works. And children historically have been singing in churches since at least the Middle Ages. And the church has always acted as a real focal point for education as well. And singing in this kind of music program really exposes children to all sorts. They learn about the church, they learn about its history, they learn about how culture and society has interacted with it. And it really deepens their understanding, as this study that's looking at children and their emotional responses, that there's a real sensitivity there. I feel that children really respond to that, I suppose, position of importance as well, and leadership. You're engaging them and involving them at a rather sort of high level, I suppose. And it's a good way of integrating them. Actually, it's interesting that this is following on from looking at how to integrate children in worship throughout. And obviously a chorister often will be in an entire service. And it's amazing how much they pick up. I've met many 12 and 13-year-olds that probably know more about liturgy than many adults. And I mean, it's partly that if you think a typical cathedral chorister probably does between 1,500 and 2,000 even songs in their 5-6 year stint as a chorister, significantly more than many clergy will do in their entire life. And it exposes them to a huge variety, I guess, of cultural and educational perspectives on faith. I think also some people might say that obviously the traditional music canon is somewhat problematic in that it is heavily dominated by white European men from a certain social perspective. But this now gives us an opportunity to critique that as well. Children have the, I guess, the intellectual inquiry to want to know why music has developed this way, why the church has done that, and what we're doing to move it forwards. And actually, in this course itself, we did have a lot of new music that was written for it, such as this next piece, which was directed by a visiting director. One thing that was particularly successful about this course was it enabled children to sing in inspiring buildings and to come together in places that they wouldn't normally get to visit. And I think that's really important in any sort of children's ministry, is embracing the awe and wonder that comes with the Anglican, I'm obviously speaking from an Anglican perspective here, the awe and wonder that comes with the way that we worship and many of the places in which we worship. One thing that was particularly useful was that we had a good relationship with the cathedral here in the Diocese of Oxford, and part of the course would always involve singing an evensong there. It was, children found it very exciting to have the opportunity to go and sing in their cathedral. It's not something that many of them get to do. And I think building those relationships is really important. There are strong networks available for church musicians. The Royal School of Church Music, as I've already mentioned, isn't massively active in Canada, but it does have a presence. It's much more active across the border in the US. But you do have things like the Royal Canadian College of Organists as well that provide these sort of networks. And it did really give them that opportunity again to feel they were contributing at a high level and that they were being appreciated much further beyond their own churches. I'm probably going to be running out of time soon, so I'll try and get in as much as I can. 1 minute short. I'll do my best. A colleague recently remarked to me that many church music adverts you see now for organist positions mention how there is a desire to restart a children's program. It obviously isn't very straightforward. And I think these days it does require a lot of creativity and thinking outside of the box. These days, most kids want to be in 4 or 5 different sports clubs. They're probably learning a couple of languages and doing art. And so a Sunday morning is no longer sacrosanct in the way it is. I know that some cathedrals in Canada, in Christchurch and Victoria, for example, successfully restarted a choristers program by doing a midweek evensong, for example. So there are many different ways in which you can do it. It does require buy-in as well at many different levels. You aren't going to start a successful children's choir if you don't have engagement from your clergy who are going to be there to support you, to reach out to the families and to think about how that group fits within the wider context of the church. It is important that it's done properly, because obviously if you give children a bad experience of church, that stays with them for their life. But I can guarantee you that the 4,000 or 5,000 children that we've had in this course, many of them have gone on to successful careers in the church and continue to look back at what they learnt in those settings. So please do feel free to contact me if you want to know more, because I realize that it's like trying to put a massive topic into a tiny amount of time. And thank you for listening.
Truth be told, Jonathan, we could listen to you the whole time and be perfectly fine.